Once upon a time, in the land of Jos, there lived a man named Kelvin. He was a very wealthy and handsome man, and he could be regarded as a man every woman would want to be with. However, at the age of 40, despite his gorgeousness, wealth, and influence, Kelvin had still not found the one who made his heart skip and good enough for marriage. In an African home, it is believed that a man of that age and status is to be married already with children running around in the home. Unfortunately, this wasn't the case for Kelvin. However, as time progressed, Kelvin met a lot of women, but for some reason, they ended up leaving him and marrying someone else. Even though his family were beginning to think this was a spiritual attack, Kelvin didn't think much of it and only proclaimed that he would get the right woman and marry her in God's time. One day, as he went out for drinks at the bar with Kalu, his friend, his eyes caught a really pretty woman who appeared to be in her early 20s. She wore a vibrant green dress and was sitting crossed legs, gently sipping on a Malta Guinness drink, while she cheerfully talked and laughed with another woman sitting beside her. The little gestures from her captivated Kelvin. This appeared to be a love at first sight for him. Overly excited and beyond captivated, he abruptly stood to move towards the women, forgetting that his friend, Kalu, was seated right across from him. Noticing this, Kalu grabbed his hand and inquired of his sudden urge to leave. Kelvin swatted his hands away and happily told him he had seen his wife and was going to get her. A confused Kalu laughed and tried to push him back on his seat, reminding him that he was single to stupor and didn't have a family of his own, at least not yet. Kelvin, who seemed a bit offended with his statement, didn't have time to reply Kalu, as he could already see the women leaving the bar. He hastily walked up to them and introduced himself. He appeared a bit nervous, but the ladies found it cute. They shook hands with Kelvin and introduced themselves as Sandra and Linda. Sandra was the pretty woman in green who had captivated Kelvin's heart, while Linda was Sandra's best friend from childhood. Upon asking for the reason he had stopped them, Kelvin made his intention known to Sandra, professing his likeness for her the moment he set his eyes on her. Sandra, who had not really experienced any meaningful and loving relationship, gave Kelvin a chance, and the two agreed to go on a dinner date the following day at 7 p.m. The next day came and Kelvin couldn't wait to see Sandra. This feeling was mutual because Sandra too felt butterflies in her stomach. 2 hours to the dinner date, Kelvin began to dress up in a blue shirt and grey suit. When the clock struck 6 p.m., Kelvin made his way to the restaurant where the date was to take place. Meanwhile, around 6:45 p.m., Sandra was already at the venue. She came clad in a pretty pink flowery skirt and a clean white top, matching it with blue heels and a purse. It was already 7:25 p.m. and Kelvin was nowhere to be found. She wondered what happened to him and was disappointed that he was late. She began to think he probably had stood her up for a reason. Maybe he's no longer interested in me. He probably thought I wouldn't be good enough for him, Sandra said in a disappointed tone. Giving up, she stood to exit the restaurant when Kelvin ran in, sweating like he had taken up a quick job of pounding fufu at the local Mama Put restaurant in the area. Sandra was stunned to see his disoriented state. She asked if he was okay and inquired of the reason behind his lateness. Kelvin shamelessly mentioned that he got into a fight with a bus driver because he hiked up the transportation fee. The transport was always 700 naira, but the idiot bus driver was asking me to pay 750 naira, citing that the cost of fuel had influenced bus prices. I didn't agree with him. I made sure I collected my complete change. He tries to prove stubborn, but I showed him that I don't play with my money, not even a small 50 naira. Kelvin narrated. Sandra was beyond surprised. She asked about his car, which Kelvin explained to have had an engine problem. Despite the initial storm at their dinner date, Sandra relaxed and tried to enjoy the moment. They talked about work, life, and family. Sandra got to know that Kelvin was a business owner and was super rich and influential, but what she did not understand was why he got into a fight over 50 naira. Nevertheless, she allowed it slide. Kelvin discovered that Sandra was a secretary at a law firm and that she really loved her job. The two had hearty conversations and got to know each other better. Everything seemed well until it was time for the payment of the food. The waiter, smiling, approached their table with the bill, and on seeing it, Kelvin almost lost his mind. He questioned why a plate of jollof rice and beef will go for 10,500 naira just for one person. The waiter was taken aback. He tried to explain that the economy has affected their prices, but Kelvin was not having any of it. He was adamant about not paying such an amount of money for the food they ate. Sandra was beyond shocked and embarrassed. When Kelvin began to cause a scene, she tried to alleviate the situation by paying for her own food, urging Kelvin to pay for only his. The bill was finally sorted, but the tension in the air was so thick that it could be cut with a knife. While every other participant in the restaurant stared at them, Sandra awkwardly picked up her purse and walked off, leaving a fuming Kelvin behind. At that moment, Sandra knew she would not have anything to do with Kelvin again. She isn't entirely sure what the problem is, but she knew that it was a stingy and stoic person. Upon her arrival back home, she told Linda everything that happened and termed the date as her worst date ever in her 24 years of life. She almost cried as she narrated her ordeal when she remembered the embarrassment that Kelvin caused her in front of so many people at the restaurant. Linda did her best to pacify Sandra and helped her change and put her to bed as she was too exhausted to do it on her own. Meanwhile, Kelvin was already home, watching football with Kalu and drinking from a bottle of beer like nothing happened. When Kalu inquired about his date, Kelvin mentioned that he had a great time and would love to do it again. He narrated the issue that transpired at the restaurant and how he was so pissed. Kalu couldn't believe his ears. He couldn't believe that his friend could do something like that again, even after all the women who came across him left him because of his stingy ways. Kalu called him out and disagreed with his behavior. Still, Kelvin didn't see anything he did wrong. In fact, he saw himself as a man who knows how to manage his finances properly. I don't waste money, Kalu. I can't be giving these restaurants my money when I know the cost of whatever they use in preparing their food. I am not plucking money from a tree in my backyard, please. It is because I know how to manage my money properly. That is why you see me living a rich life today. You should also emulate that, my friend, and do as I am doing, Kelvin said to Kalu. Kalu was speechless and decided to leave him be this time, since talking to him could be a lost cause. That night, Kelvin tried to call Sandra on the phone, but she wouldn't respond or return his calls. He assumed she was asleep already and decided to call the next day. The next day came. Still, there was no response from Sandra. A week later, they bumped into each other at the local supermarket. While Kelvin tried to strike up a conversation and asked why she had been ghosting him, Sandra ignored him and turned to walk away. Kelvin was not ready to let the love of his life go. He ran after her and knelt down before her, begging for her to give him a second chance. Sandra was shocked. Unable to handle another embarrassment, she immediately agreed and asked him to get up. They got into his car and talked for a while. Sandra made it known to Kelvin that she hated his behavior at the restaurant, to which Kelvin apologized and said it wasn't always like that. That person wasn't me, Sandra, baby. I didn't know what came over me. Please, baby, forgive me. Sandra couldn't help but agree. Seeing Kelvin begging and making a puppy face did something to her. She found it cute. All right, just don't do it again. You have this money, Kelvin. It's okay to treat yourself once in a while. What if you die today? Who would end up spending your fortune that you have built for so many years? Is it your next of kin? You or your spirit would come back from the grave to enjoy the money. I'm sure you know that you are not Jesus Christ who rose from the dead. So please, honey, live life and live it right, said Sandra. The two hugged and promised to meet up for another date the next day. From that day onward, their relationship excelled and eventually blossomed into marriage. 6 months later, they welcomed their daughter Amira. She became their center of affection and love. However, as she began to grow, Sandra started seeing the past life of Kelvin come to play. Though he would exhibit a stingy attitude in the past, even after their marriage, it was in a subtle way such that you wouldn't easily notice if you didn't know him. However, his stingy behavior started getting out of hand when it began to affect his own flesh and blood. One day, 6-year-old Amira informed her father Kelvin that she would like to change her school bag since the one she was presently using at the time was old. It was a bag she had been using since she was 2 years old, at the start of her education. Kelvin, however, requested to see the bag and went on to use a needle and thread to sew up the places that were torn out. Sandra walked in on this and couldn't believe her eyes. She cried and regretted ever marrying him. How can you have a lot of money and still allow your child to take tattered bags to school, Kelvin? This was not what you promised me. You this man, Chai, I am tired of you and your stingy ways. Yet you won't let me work so that I can take care of my child by myself. You are a wicked man, Kelvin. You are very wicked, said Sandra. She then walked away with Amira. Meanwhile, Kelvin didn't budge. He couldn't see the reason for her outburst again. He was already used to her complaint, so it was just like old times. Sandra called Linda and explained all she had been facing in her marriage to her friend. Linda was angry and asked to come over to their house to set Kelvin straight, but Sandra didn't want that. Even though Linda had warned Sandra about Kelvin before they married, she never listened. It got to a point where it almost cost their friendship because Sandra accused Linda of wanting to steal her man instead, since she hadn't seen any good man who wanted to put a ring on her finger yet. At the time, Linda was livid. She couldn't believe Sandra could say something like that to her, considering all they have been through together and how they always looked out for each other. In the long run, Sandra apologized and their friendship blossomed again. Since Sandra really loved Kelvin, Linda decided to support her friend and their marriage. But now, things aren't what Sandra envisioned, and Linda wasn't happy about it. Few days later, Sandra was in the kitchen making lunch when the cooking gas suddenly got finished. She pondered whether to tell Kelvin or not, afraid that he might flare up again about spending money for a refill. She did it anyways. After all, they needed to eat. Kelvin was more than pissed at Sandra for demanding money for gas. He asked her why the cooking gas quickly got finished when it was filled up 4 months ago. Sandra was bewildered. She couldn't believe Kelvin wanted the cooking gas to last for infinity. Kelvin, what do you mean? Are you saying a 6 kg of cooking gas should last us forever or until Jesus comes? We have been using this gas for 4 months, Kelvin. 4 months! Please, have mercy and stop stressing me. Just go and fill up the gas, please, Sandra said and walked out on him. She was beginning to get irritated by his constant stiff hands. She wished she could just leave him and the marriage, but she can't because what will people say? Divorce is against her beliefs. She has to find a way to change him, Sandra thought to herself. Many days later, a family meeting was called. Sandra had complained bitterly to Kelvin's relatives and hers, telling them how his tight-fisted hands had been making life hell for her and her child Amira. She explained that Kelvin doesn't give her money for upkeep. He only pays school fees and stock up the house with foodstuffs by himself. He never allows her to go to the market to buy anything because he didn't want her, according to him, to rip him off whatever money came out as change from groceries shoppings. She also explained to the family how Kelvin has refused to change his old boxers that he had been wearing since they married. On hearing this, Kelvin flared up at the meeting and asked Sandra to stop sharing such private information to the world. Sandra, warn yourself, oh, leave my boxers alone. At least they are not smelling. Or are they dirty whenever I come close to you? Why should I change them when the boxers are not yet turned? They only lost their original color. Please, leave my boxers alone. The family members at the meeting were beyond flabbergasted. Kelvin relatives wondered why he was the way he is, while Sandra relatives were even more pissed. Adako, Sandra's elder sister, took matters into her own hands. She couldn't take it anymore. She called out Kelvin and warned him seriously to stop being stingy, thereby making her sister and her kid life to suffer. Kelvin warned Adako to never talk to him in such a condescending manner, accusing her of being jealous of her sister since she wasn't married yet. Kelvin accused Adako of flaunting her big ass in front of him when he came to pay Sandra's bride price. And just because he didn't notice her, she's angry and accusing him of stinginess. Adako couldn't believe her ears. She almost hit a chair on Kelvin's head. if not for the elders at the meeting who called her to order. When the tension was reduced, the elders implored Kelvin to live better and take care of his family by seeing to their needs at every given time. Kelvin thanked the elders and promised to adjust, even though he felt there wouldn't be any need for it, as he didn't see himself with the problem. Sandra hoped the meeting would finally change her husband, but she was wrong. He became even worse. Some months later, when Amira fell ill, Sandra called Kelvin's attention to it and asked that their child be taken to a hospital for a proper checkup and care. Kelvin didn't buy this idea. He thought it was a waste of money. Rather, he suggested that Amira be given over-the-counter drugs, saying that malaria was a common sickness and prescribing it to be what Amira was suffering from. Left with no other choice, Sandra got malaria drugs from the pharmacy for her child. Unfortunately, the drugs were of no effect. Amira was still as sick as before. Sandra was worried. She informed Kelvin again of their daughter's situation and emphasized the need for her to be taken to a hospital. Kelvin, however, suggested another method of treatment. He turned himself into a doctor once again. This time, however, he became a native doctor and suggested that Amira be given a mixture of herbs plucked from different trees. He mentioned that that was the way he was treated whenever he was sick growing up in the olden days. Sandra couldn't believe her ears. At that point, she regretted ever meeting a man like Kelvin. She regretted marrying a man like him. Amira's condition was getting worse. Sandra was very worried. She regretted listening to Kelvin about not working to make her own money. Her child wouldn't be suffering like this if she was a working class woman. She would have immediately taken her child to the hospital to get a medical care, Sandra thought as she cried. This isn't the time to regret and feel sorry for my miserable life. I have to do something. My child is dying, Sandra said. She wiped her teary face and immediately contacted Linda and her sister Adaku to come to the house while Kelvin was away. She explained the situation to them and they questioned her on why she didn't inform them early enough. Sandra almost broke into tears as she explained that she was embarrassed and ashamed since they both have warned her not to marry a man like Kelvin. Linda and Adaku assured Sandra of their support regardless of whatever might have happened. They love her and Amira and would always be there for them anytime, any day. Sandra was grateful to them as they shared a group hug. The trio took Amira to the hospital where treatment was immediately administered to her. Even though the hospital bills had been cleared by both Linda and Adaku, Sandra still wanted her husband, Kelvin, to know that their child was receiving treatment at the hospital and needed to send money. She called him and asked for him to send the sum of 50,000 naira. Kelvin, who was driving at the time, almost had an accident on hearing the amount. He shouted and asked why the hospital bill was so expensive. He called the doctors and nurses thieves, saying they were out to rip people off with their fake white coats and gowns. Sandra ignored his tantrums and asked that he sends the money immediately. Fuming and cursing loudly, Kelvin mistakenly wired a sum of 5 million naira into Sandra's account. Initially, he was oblivious to this, but on getting a debit alert on his phone, he saw the figure he sent and shouted painfully, almost causing a passerby a heart attack. He immediately contacted Sandra and asked her to refund the balance of 4,950,000 naira. Sandra just eased and cut off the call. He called again, and this time, Sandra's number wasn't reachable. Kelvin almost died and resurrected. He was already sweating profusely. Few hours later, he called Sandra's phone again to request that she returns his money. This time, Sandra cried bitterly on the phone. She cursed him on the phone and told him so many horrible things. All you care about is your money.
Money that you don't even spend on your family. You didn't even care to know how your child is doing. You are wicked, Kelvin. Guess what? You have finally achieved your aim in life. You have killed my only child, Kelvin. You have succeeded in ruining my life just as yours has been ruined. I will never forgive you for this, Kelvin. You this stingy man. Your tight-fistedness has finally yielded a great loss. Kelvin, you killed Amira. You murdered my only baby. You are a wicked man, Kelvin. Sandra cried on the phone. Kelvin couldn't believe his ears. His phone almost fell from his hands. He immediately tried to inquire about what happened, but the phone went off. He called and called Sandra's phone, but she never picked. Scared now, Kelvin hopes that what he heard on the phone was some sick joke because he can't afford to lose his only child. Much later, Sandra came home with Adaku and Linda to pack her belongings. She was done with the marriage for good. On seeing this, Kelvin knew he messed up and there was no solution to this old tragedy. He knelt and begged Sandra for forgiveness. He said he was sorry and didn't know what came over him. He wept bitterly, begging Sandra not to go. However, Sandra had already made up her mind. She was leaving his stingy house for good. For days, Kelvin stayed at home, mourning the loss of his child and wife. He hugged their pictures as he proclaimed he was sorry so many times, asking God for forgiveness and the return of his wife. Some days, Kalu stuck by him, feeding him and taking care of him because he had become a shadow of himself. Since Sandra left to Adaku's house, Kelvin would go there to stand at the gate for many hours, pleading to speak to Sandra, but it was a lost cause. Sandra had moved on. Kelvin contacted all the family members to beg Sandra on his behalf. Still, Sandra wasn't ready to start afresh with Kelvin. She was pained and hungry. Kelvin thought about Amira a lot. He would look at her photos and beg for her forgiveness. He was still confused about her death. To get clarity, he went to the hospital where she was treated to seek answers from the doctors. On getting there, the doctors told him that Amira had suffered a chronic typhoid disease, which has eaten deep into her body system. Unfortunately, she was brought in late, and the treatment given to her couldn't fight off the sickness quickly enough. Sadly, she passed on just few hours after she was brought in. The doctors mentioned the possibility of Amira surviving if she had been brought in a day before. Kelvin wanted to die. He considered himself a failed father and husband as he cried bitterly on the hospital floor. After some months, Linda and Adaku spoke to Sandra about going back to her husband since he was really remorseful about his actions. Sandra didn't want to hear of it. She claimed she hated Kelvin with everything within her. "I'm not going back to him. He killed my child," Sandra said. In the following days, Kelvin would deliver flowers and gifts almost every day at Adaku's doorstep. The gifts, which were meant for Sandra, came with different colorful notes that expresses how sorry Kelvin is. He promised to have changed and proclaimed to be a better person. Kelvin's gesture gradually got to Sandra. She visited him at home and they talked. Sandra expressed how broken she was and how much he hurt her. Kelvin apologized and promised to never be a stingy man again. He explained that it wasn't always like that. Growing up, his father was a very wealthy man whom everyone in their community knew and wanted to dine with. His father would give out to the needy and often organize large feasts for the community to eat and be merry. Those who do not know where their next source of meal will come were always grateful for these kind gestures. Kelvin's father was an odogu in town. He lived up to his name, buying clothes and building houses for the poor. He even sent so many community children whose parents couldn't afford their fees to school on scholarships. But one day, everything came crashing down. Kelvin's father suddenly went bankrupt when he was close to retirement. He had forgotten to save up for the raining days. As he worked and made money, he gave and spent without thinking twice about his and his children's future. It was a glooming time for his father. At the time, his father expected the community to sympathize with him and be supportive. However, when the community noticed that Kelvin's father no longer has money to organize their favorite feast,
They began to mock him and called him a ritualist who used his late wife for sacrifice to become rich. They declared that his riches didn't last long because his hands were full of innocent people's blood. The man who had helped a lot of people in love and kindness was now being seen as an evil man because he no longer had money to throw a feast. Kelvin saw his father hide in their house for years, running away from the accusing fingers and glances of the community. The accusations weighed him down to the extent that he felt depressed and passed away from it. It was then that Kelvin decided to never give anybody his hard-earned money. He became convinced that people were wicked and that they would never appreciate you regardless of whatever you do to them. He grew up to work so hard and save up his money, denying himself and even those around him the goodness of hard work. He did all this because his father failed to plan and save up for the rainy days. On hearing Kelvin's account, Sandra empathized with him and assured him that not all human beings are like his community people. She begged him to do away with such mentality and be open-minded, especially to his family at least. With tears in his eyes, Kelvin promised to be a better person. They hugged each other, and at that moment, Amira walked in with Linda and Adaku. On seeing Amira, Kelvin almost ran out of the room. He thought he had seen a ghost. He wiped his eyes multiple times to be sure he was seeing right. He only calmed down when Sandra beckoned on Amira to come closer to them. Sandra explained to Kelvin that their child never died, though she would have been if she had waited a second more before taking her to the hospital. Amira was treated immediately they got to the hospital. Thankfully, she got better faster than the doctors anticipated. She explained that she, Linda, and Adaku planned to teach him a lesson in order to stop him from exhibiting a stingy behavior. Kelvin was shocked and happy at the same time. He asked why the doctors lied to him about Amira's death. Sandra acknowledged that the doctors were in on the prank too. Kelvin was so happy that he hugged Amira so tight. "My little angel, I'm sorry. Please forgive Daddy." Amira, smiling, nodded and said, "It's okay, Daddy. I love you." Kelvin burst into tears and hugged her tighter. Kelvin apologized to Adaku for his past behavior and sought her and Linda's forgiveness. They all shared a group hug before Linda and Adaku excused the family. Kelvin apologized profusely to Sandra and Amira and promised to be a good husband and a father thereon. He hugged his family tight and didn't want to ever let go until Amira said, "Daddy, they're squeezing me too tight. I might die for real this time." Kelvin and Sandra laughed heartily at their daughter's silliness. Days later, Kelvin surprised his wife and kids to an all-expense-paid trip to Abuja, Nigeria, one of the most beautiful cities in the country. They had a lot of fun, ate whatever they wanted, and played many games. For the first time, Sandra actually felt she was truly married. She was beyond elated and shocked at the same time. She couldn't believe Kelvin had changed like he promised. He got her and Amira so many gifts days earlier on their shopping spree. She now wears the latest designers in vogue. She and her daughter now turn earths because they look more beautiful and their skin is now glowing more than the sun. Kelvin actually outdid himself on their various trips, even abroad too. He spoils them silly and she's all in for it. She had waited for this day to come, a day to finally enjoy her husband's money. Now, she's living the life and she is so grateful to God and to the people around her who constantly watched out for her and her child. Sandra and her family are presently in Italy. She made a mental note to get something special from her trip for Linda and Adaku for their unwavering support and love. Our story ends here today. I hope you enjoyed listening just as much as I enjoyed writing it. What are your thoughts on this story? What have you learned so far? Please drop your opinions in the comment section. I would love to engage with you. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe to the channel and give our videos a thumbs up to help me grow. It will mean a lot to me and help me stay consistent. See you next time for another exciting episode. Take care and bye for now.